Hey Dev Team, welcome back to Flutter with Drag. Today I want to start getting us ready on this conference app to take payments, large payments. To do this, we're going to be using an external provider. Now it's important to note you can't use an external provider if you are trying to take payments for something to do with your app, such as a subscription, or if you're trying to sell part of access to part of your app, something like that, then you need to go through the Google Play Store or the Apple Store in order for that payment to work. However, if you're building a shop or indeed selling conferences like we're doing, then you can, because of the large transaction values, you can use an external provider. And the external provider we're going to be using is a provider called Stripe. So that is at www.stripe.com. This is the payment provider, and I'm using this because they've got a pretty good Flutter package, and I am familiar with them. Is the honest answer. I use them in my work. So once you've signed up for Stripe, and it's totally free to sign up for a test account, what you will have is an account in test mode. To switch from test mode to a live mode, you'll need to submit documents and proof of various bits and bobs, but for development, test mode is fine. That's what we need, and we can get started. So once you've signed up for your account with Stripe, we can move forward. Okay, so first things first, we're going to need a package installed. So I'm going to add a package, and that is simply Flutter_Stripe. Let's get that running. And I've just noticed some error messages here at the bottom. That's because I haven't got my server running yet, but that's okay. Now I'm going to stop my app because there are some changes we're going to have to make for this to work. First off, we need to come to our Android app build Gradle, and in here we need to make sure that our minimum SDK version is set to 21. Okay, so I've done that. Next, we need to come down to our other build Gradle. This is the package build Gradle, and we need to make sure that our Kotlin version is greater than 1.50. Well, it is here, so we're good to go. If it's not, just change it to what I've got, 1.6.10, and that should be okay. The next thing, we need to come to our Android app source main resources and values styles.xml, and we need to make sure that this normal theme at the bottom is set to theme.material components. Finally, we need to come to our app source Kotlin main activity, and we need to change this Flutter activity to a Flutter fragment activity. Basically, a fragment activity accesses some of the old Android APIs, which is needed for this. Okay, with all that done, let's save and let's open up our main file. Right, Android main, and let's just rebuild the app. Okay, and that failed because we haven't actually imported this in here, and because I'm not using Android Studio, it didn't point that out. Never mind, we'll just add fragment up here as well to our import statement to ensure we're importing it. Okay, let's try rebuilding that once again. Okay, and it looks like we're rebuilt now without errors, so that's all good. Okay, so within our Flutter app now, in the screens, I'm going to create a new file called payment_test.dart, and this is going to be our payment test page, and it's going to be a stateful widget for now, just so I can keep it all in one place while we set it up, because what we're trying to do really is get this payment test to work, and it's the server that I'm focusing on mainly in this episode. So in payment test, we're going to return, it's going to be a standalone page, so we're going to return a scaffold. We'll have an app bar, which will have a title, text, payment test. Okay. Then in the body, we're going to create a column which has two children, both of which are a text button. First one is going to be our initialize button. This is going to initialize the payment. Initialize. And the second one is going to be the one to make payment, something like that. Okay, we need to get this page showing, so let's come back to our main.dart and we'll add that as a page in our root. So we'll call this payment test, and that's going to be the payment test screen. And up here in our block listener, for now, if we are logged in, we're, instead of going to the home page, which I'm just going to comment out, we're going to go to the payment test page. So let's save that, refresh the app, and there we are. We have our two buttons, our initialize and our make payment. Okay, so what does the initialize do? Well, the way Stripe payments work is that you have to remember we cannot trust the user. You can never trust the user of your app. So all the information that we want about the payment needs to come from the server, not the app. The only thing the app needs to provide really is the number that the user types in, their credit card number or their debit card number, or indeed if they're using Apple Pay or Google Pay. So we have to get some information from the server, and it's our server that's going to be communicating with Stripe. So let's create a function. We can close all of this down, just have our payment test. Within our state here, let's create a function which we'll call init payment. Okay, now this is going to be an asynchronous call because it's going to need to go off to our server and get some information. And what it's going to do is it's going to get some payment info for us. And a payment info is basically a map. So let's store that within our state. We'll create a map of string dynamic, which is going to be optional, which we'll call payment info. Okay, and so our payment info is going to equal something. So we'll put get this from server. We'll have to come back to that. Once we've got that information, we can then initiate what's called a payment sheet. So we can say here await Stripe dot instance. So let's import Stripe. So Stripe dot instance dot init payment sheet, and that's going to take a set of parameters. The parameters are, let's put this on the next line here so we can see what we're doing. Parameters are going to be from setup payment sheet parameters. And so we're going to have some information. And what we're going to put here for now is Apple Pay. Are we going to allow Apple Pay? Yes. Although it won't work in our emulator, but we'll put it in for now anyway. Google Pay? Yes. Whoops, not true. Not test, sorry, true. Style. Well, we've got theme mode and we can have light or dark. So I'm just going to take light. Test environment. Yes, we're currently testing, so we're using the test environment. Merchant country code, where you need to put in your country code. I'm GB. Merchant display name, well, we'll have Global Conference 2023. And then we need a customer ID. We need a payment intent client secret. And we need a customer ephemeral key secret. What are they? Okay, well, let's just get this in for a second, like so. Well, these are information we're going to get back from the server. First of all, the customer ID is the customer ID on Stripe. If we come to the Stripe website here and come to customers, we have no customers. But when we do have customers, they will have an ID. So we need to create a customer if they haven't already got one and get their ID, or utilize the ID if the customer already exists. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing is a payment intent client secret. And that is a secret key that the Stripe server gives us. So we will say, our server will tell the Stripe server, hey, we want to charge this customer this amount of money for this purpose, and it will give us an intent. It's an intent for the customer to pay, and it will give us a secret key for that, which we will put in here. We'll also get this secret key, which links to the customer and basically gives this Stripe here access to this payment with a secret key that only lasts a fairly short period of time. So what we don't want to do is hard code in here our secret keys. So what do I mean by secret keys? Well, if we come to our home page, we have a couple of secret keys here. One of them is hidden, and that needs to be super secret. You're the only person who should ever know that. It'll need to go into the server, and the server will need to know that, but that will give you basically administration access to Stripe. We also have this publishable key, which is not so secure. It doesn't really matter who's got that, and we're going to embed this into our Flutter app. So if somebody was to decompile the Flutter app, they would be able to get that key, but it's okay, it can't do much, it can't do any damage by itself. That's why it's a publishable key. So in fact, while we're here, I'm going to copy that because we need to put this into our Flutter app. So I'm going to come to main, and right at the top, before we initialize Firebase, I'm going to put in here Stripe dot, and we'll need to import Stripe first. It'd help if I spelled Stripe right. Stripe dot publishable key equals, and we're going to put that key in, and that's fine. We're then going to await for the stripe.instance to apply settings to make sure all that settings are applied. And once we've done that, Stripe can be used throughout our app. Okay, I'm just going to do a refresh to make sure that's taken effect. Okay, so we need to get this information. So let's write some code to do that. Well, we're going to have to get it from our server. So this is going to have to go within our conference, close that down, within our conference repository. So in our conference interface, let's add some Stripe stuff in here. For now, we just need to do the one. So we're going to get a future, which is going to be a map of string dynamic, and we'll call this create payment sheet. Okay. Now that will complain that our conference.dart doesn't have that. So let's come up to the conference repository, control dot, and create that one missing override, which will put it down the bottom. Now within our conference app, we've already got this future forget. Last time we edited this area, we created this patch, and I'm going to take this patch, I'm going to copy and paste it, and this is now going to be a post, and instead of HTTP patch, it's going to be HTTP post, which does really the same thing as patch, but it posts instead of patches. Still need our authorization, our headers, and all the rest of it, and that's fine. Okay, so let's come down to this create payment sheet. And this is going to be very straightforward. We're going to have a final response. It's going to equal await our post, and we're going to post to a path which we're going to call Stripe payment sheet. And for the body, we're not going to send anything in yet, but we could send in information if we wanted to, such as maybe we would want to send in the amount that we're charging, various other things. I'm going to leave that blank for now. We don't need that. And we're going to return that response. That needs to be an async. And that's that. So coming back to our payment test, we just need to change this payment info to context.read, read our conference repository, and if we import Flutter block here, we can now create our payment sheet and get that information. And of course we need to await it to get that out. Okay, so payment info is now going to contain these bits of information. So instead of 123, we're going to say the customer ID is going to be the payment info customer. And now this can't be a const because we're changing it. Copy that, paste and paste. The second one here is going to be our payment intent, and the next one is going to be our ephemeral key, like so. Okay, so we have all of that information now stored. Okay, so we want that to happen when we press the initialize button here, but I only want to make sure this happens once. So what I'm going to do here, for this onPressed is say if payment info does not equal null, or init payment. Okay, what's that just done? Let me explain. So init payment will put some information into payment info. So when this state starts, payment info is null. So onPressed, does payment info equal null? Well, no, it doesn't. So it's going to do this. And it's hopefully going to run all this. And now payment info isn't going to equal null. Now, if you put a null, I've got too many commas there. If we put a null into an onPress, so for example, if I just change that to null, then that disables the button. So what we're saying here is if we've already got payment info, yeah, if it doesn't equal null, then we're going to disable the button. If we haven't got the payment info, we're going to go and get it. And then we're going to do the opposite for this button. We're going to say if payment info does not equal null, then we're going to do something. And what we're going to do is display the payment sheet or null. Okay, so if we haven't initialized, the initialization button will be available to us, and if we have initialized, then the text, the make payment button will be available to us. Now, because that needs to rebuild, then once we've got this information here, we're going to call set state just to make sure that the state here is rebuilt and so that the right thing is shown. So now we just need to create this function here to display the sheet. And that's very straightforward. It's going to be an asynchronous await stripe instance present payment sheet. And that's all we need to do. So if we look now at our app, you can see that the make payment button is grayed out. And that's because it's currently null. Payment information does equal null. So we're putting null into the onPress, which will disable it. I can't push this button yet because it will error out because we're not dealing with our server yet. So let's do that now. Let's come to our server and code the server side of things. So coming to our server, let's get into our server directory. We need to install a couple of packages. So npm install. First of all, we need Stripe because we need to access Stripe. And I'm also going to include a package called .env so that we can have some configuration environmental variables stored, and we'll see that in a second. Let's just give those a second to install. Okay, those are both installed. So let's close that down. Let's come to our server index. And at the top here, we're going to import env from .env. We're then going to call env.config path.env, like so. So it's basically saying we're going to load in environmental variables from a file called .env. Let's create that file. env. Now in here we need one environmental variable, and that's going to be our stripe secret key, and that's going to equal the Stripe secret key. Having done that, we will be able to access our secret key within our code by doing something like this. Let's just console log it out. Console.log process end Stripe secret key. Now if we run our server, we should see, yes, run serve, we should see ABC once it's recompiled. There we go. So there's ABC running, being read in from our environmental area. Okay, so we don't need to console log that out. In fact, that would be dangerous. So all you need to do is come to your Stripe, view your secret key, your test key, and paste it in instead of ABC. So I'll do that now. Okay, the next thing we need to do is set up a controller for our Stripe. So I'm going to put in here app use Stripe, and that's going to require auth for now, and we're going to create a Stripe controller. Okay, that doesn't exist, so let's come to our controllers, create a new file called stripe.ts, and in here we're going to say const router equals router from Express, and then at the very end of the file we're going to say export router as Stripe controller. Save that, come back to our index, we should now be able to import that, and that should give us our Stripe controller. Okay, so what do we need to do? Well, we need to have our payment sheet post route set up. So a router post, and if you remember, this is coming from our conference interface. This is our router route here, Stripe payment sheet. So when someone posts to Stripe payment sheet, bearing in mind that this is in the Stripe route, so Stripe is always going to be fixed to the URL. In that case, we're going to have an async function, which is going to take in a request and a response. So we're going to need the user ID. So let's get that out. Const user ID equals the request UID. Now we know that they've got a UID by this point, because if they haven't, it will have errored out previously. They wouldn't have got this far without a UID. I'm going to put at this point, sorry, this UID could be null. So just to make sure our code understands that the UID is there, I'm going to put if UID is undefined, we're going to return with a status of 401, which is basically unauthorized, but it means now the rest of our code knows that UID exists. We also need our secret key, so we'll get that out of our environment. So that equals process environment Stripe secret key. Fantastic. And then we need to set up Stripe so we can talk to it. We can do that by putting Stripe equals new Stripe, which we import from Stripe, and we pass to that the secret key as a string, and also some options. We're going to say that the API version that we're working on is this 2020-08-27, and also that TypeScript is true. Okay, so that sets up our communication to Stripe. And because we're using our secret key, Stripe knows it's us and it's trusted. So next we need to find out, is this user a current Stripe user? Okay, well, how are we going to do that? Well, basically when we set up a user in Stripe, Stripe will give us a unique customer ID for that user, and we're going to store it within our Firestore database. Let's come to Firestore, and we have our users collection, and this is me at the moment, Drag. We could store the customer ID here inside this collection, but I don't want to do that because this collection does get sent to the app frequently, and if other users are looking up our user's profile, there's no need for them to know the Stripe customer ID. So I'm going to set up a new collection which we're simply going to call Stripe users. So we're going to say here, we're going to check that collection to see if we've got a user. So const user doc data equals await db collection. What collection? Stripe users doc UID, so the user's ID, get. Okay, now at the moment this user doesn't exist, so it's not going to get any data. So we can say if user doc data exists, we're going to do something, else we're going to do something else. And what we want to do is basically get the Stripe customer ID. So let's create that variable, Stripe customer ID. Okay, so if the user document does exist, then the Stripe customer ID is going to equal the user doc data, and we'll get the Stripe ID. If it doesn't exist, well, we're going to then have to create that user on Stripe. But to create that user, we need a bit more information. We're going to need to know the user's email address, which is stored within the authentication in Firebase. So we're already dealing with Firebase here, and I know we've called this Firestore, and I keep meaning to rename this to Firebase. We will do at some point. But let's get Firebase auth out of there, and that's going to equal admin.auth. And I'm going to export that as well. Okay. So don't forget, this admin is our Firebase admin. And again, we're authorized because we're passing in this service account. Okay, so here we can now say const Firebase user is going to equal our Firebase auth get user, and we'll pass in the user ID, and that will return to us a user record from Firebase. Once we've got that, we can create our Stripe user. So we're going to get a result from that, but we're going to basically say here await stripe dot customers dot create, and there's all sorts of information we can pass here: their address, balance, whether they've got coupons, invoice prefixes, phone numbers, all sorts of stuff. But as you can see, it's all optional. Okay, and so for now we're just going to pass the email, and the email is going to be the Firebase users email that we've got. Okay, so that's going to create the record on Stripe. So we can now get out the Stripe customer ID there, and that's basically going to be the result.id. Okay, now we need to make sure that that is saved in our database for future. So we're going to take this line here, but instead of getting the document, we're going to create the document, and we're going to create the Stripe ID and put in the Stripe customer ID. So if the user exists, we're just going to get the data, the Stripe ID, out of it. If the user doesn't exist, we're going to create the user on Stripe and save the Stripe ID back to our database so that the next time this comes around, it does exist. And so we'll only have one record on Stripe for this customer. Okay. Next, we need to create our ephemeral key. Ephemeral key, and that is going to be, again, done with Stripe because it's the Stripe servers that do that. We're going to create an ephemeral key, and there you can see that it says it creates a short-lived API key for a given resource. Okay, and that resource is going to be a customer, that customer ID, and that is that. We're also going to put in some options, which is basically going to be, no, not an API key, API version, and we're going to have the same version that we had before, 2020 08 27, like so. Okay, so that creates our ephemeral key. Then we need to create our payment intent, and that is going to be another communication with Stripe, payment intents, create. And we're going to say we want to create a payment for an amount. Well, I'm just going to create a payment for an amount of, and this is in units, so either in cents or in my case in pence. We're going to put the currency. You can put your own currency here, but my currency is GBP, so this is £87. If we put USD here, it would be $87 and 0 cents. We need to tell it the customer, and that is the Stripe customer ID. And we need to say what payment methods we accept. And in this case, we are going to accept only card. Payment method, I think it's types, yeah, types, card. Okay, that is our payment intent. So now, with that, all that information, we need to return that back to our app. So res JSON, result JSON, payment intent is going to be the payment intent client secret. The ephemeral key is going to be the ephemeral key secret. And the customer is going to be the Stripe customer ID. And that's it. So we've got the payment intent, the ephemeral key, and the customer all being sent back. And so if we come back to our payment test page, that's that. Customer, payment intent, the ephemeral key. So with all that in place, I think we're good to go. So let's hard restart our app. And come to our Stripe page. So within Stripe, let's go to our customers. We have no customers. Okay. Within our Firestore, we have no Stripe users. So let's click the initialize and see what error messages we get. Okay, so we have got an error message, but this is one that is known about within the Stripe documentation. We can ignore that. If we refresh our Firestore app now, we can see that we've got a Stripe users, and we can see that our user YDDS, which is my user, has a Stripe ID of custom LBSE. If we come to our Stripe customers and refresh, we can see that we now have a customer, me. And we can see that we've got an incomplete transaction for 87. Well, that's because we've not put any payment information yet. This is the intent. And this is what the timer is here. If this isn't completed within, I'm not sure what the time is, but within a little while, that will just delete itself. That will disappear. Okay, but we have a payment intent for that. So come back to our app. We can now click Make Payment. And there we go. We have our payment information up. So let's try and put it in. Now Stripe provides a load of test card numbers. So let's see if we can fail a transaction. First of all, let's use a card that has insufficient funds. And this number is given to us by Stripe, 9995. Let's say 0523 123, and it doesn't matter about the zip code here. So let's pay our £87. This is now communicating with Stripe, and we're told our card has insufficient funds. Okay, let's come back here and put in the test card number. The test card number, which is valid, which is essentially a lot of 4242s. So this is a valid card. Well, it's not a valid card, it's a valid test card, and this should process the transaction. There we go. We have a green link and our transaction is being processed. Let's come back to our customer now and refresh. And we can see, hopefully on this page, that now that we have a succeeded payment from this customer for our £87. So we can see that we had a failed payment and then we had a succeeded payment. And that is exactly what happened. So folks, that's the beginning of our payment journey. There's a lot more to do yet. We need to set up the ability for Stripe to tell our servers that payment has been made and various other things, but we'll deal with that in another episode. For now, if you've enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. It does help me out, and we'll see you next time. Until then, take care folks. Bye now.